Hey guys, Morgan the Rebellious Reviewer. We talk about music, books, movies, and Pokemon? Yup, it's time for another ambitious project, one where I assign certain albums, books, and movies to each Pokemon based on what I imagine their taste would be. And we're going to be starting at the first entry in the Pokedex, that being Bulbasaur, and then working our way to the end. Now, we're going to start with Bulbasaur's favorite music, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and then we're going to do two separate videos for books and movies next. Before we get started with the albums, though, let me set a few rules. 1. These albums are in no particular order aside from the honorable mentions, which are in alphabetical order. 2. Once I put an album on this list, it will be off limits for the rest of Generation 1. Same applies to the rest of the generations when I get to them, and the exception to this rule is the honorable mentions. Those can go to other Pokemon. And 3, I tried to vary the genres up as much as possible, so don't be surprised if certain albums get relegated to the honorable mentions because they're too similar in sound to another album on the list. Without further ado, let's get started with our honorable mentions, shall we? This is the last album I cut, and man was it a painful one. It's got both new age and classical elements, both genres I think Bulbasaur likes. It has a nature theme, which I think Bulbasaur as a grass type would appreciate. And I also think Bulbasaur would appreciate how soothing and calm and also kind of warm this album is. However, I already had a classical album on here, and also an ambient album, so I figured putting a neoclassical new age album would be a bit redundant. Plus, there was another album from another genre that I really wanted to get on the list, so I was running out of room. So, this ended up getting cut. Rest assured, though, that Bulbasaur still really likes it. Consider this his honorary number 11, I guess. I was originally going to put this album on the list proper. It's a calm, warm dungeon synth album, and it has a frog theme. Which, in case you didn't know, Bulbasaur was actually based on frogs and toads. So, I thought that would be fitting. However, I then started reading the Rate Your Music comments, and apparently this album may or may not have been plagiarized from a classical musician, and apparently the cover is AI generated. Which, those two things combined, make me think that more effort could have been put into this. I still think Bulbasaur would like it, mainly because it's about as soothing as Bulbasaur is to injured Pokemon on the show, and partially because of the frog theme. However, I don't feel comfortable putting it any higher than the honorable mentions on this list. Don't worry, Dungeon Synth fans. There will be a Dungeon Synth album on the list proper. Oh, and another one in the honorable mentions. This is a prime example of an album getting edged off the list because of the whole genre variety thing. This album is a perfect album for Bulbasaur. Both because of the aforementioned calm, soothing atmosphere that I mentioned when talking about seeking the sources of streams and slumbering sounds of the Frog Fellowship, but also because this one also has a bit of a nature theme. Technically, it's based on J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, but there are nature recordings throughout, including bird chirping throughout along the Great East Road, cows graze on emerald fields, crickets chirping on through the Bindwell Wood, and even some frog sounds on the opener with dreams of adventure, I smoke from my long pipe beneath the stars. The only reason I didn't put this on the list proper is because there was another Dungeon Synth album that has all of the qualities I just mentioned pretty much, and it's a little bit happier sounding. Bulbasaur strikes me as the type of Pokemon who likes calm, happy things, particularly in the arts. So this album got edged off, but rest assured, Bulbasaur still loves it. Now let's take a break from the Dungeon Synth and talk about some Celtic New Age. I can see the lights in the distance coming in the dark of night. This was easily the second most painful cut on this entire list, next to Seeking the Sources of Streams. This one got cut because I already had a folk album on here, and I needed to cut something in order to maintain genre variety. Still, I think this album fits Bulbasaur really well because of its calm, soothing, beautiful, lush sort of sound, and I also think the vaguely pagan feel of songs like All Souls Night would be appreciated by Bulbasaur. After all, pagans often worship nature, and grass types strike me as pretty nature-oriented. Also, this type of music is often used by New Age spiritual types, and whether you believe in that stuff or not, in theory at least, the point of it is to be healing, which I'm pretty sure Bulbasaur approves of healing if the cartoon is any indicator. But enough about Irish music. Let's talk about their arch rivals, the English, next.
I'll take you through my dreams.
I discovered this one in the process of making this video, and it is a great Bulbasaur album. It has a nature theme. There's some happiness and warmth to it, and it can also be quite calm and soothing at times. So why isn't it on the list? Well, notice how I said it's mostly really relaxing? Yeah. This one also has some rock elements, meaning it ends up being more energetic at points. Particularly, the guitar solos on songs like Lady Margaret and Glasgirian drag this down the Bulbasaur list for me. I still think Bulbasaur would like it, but there was a pure folk album on this list that I think fit Bulbasaur a little bit better, and there's even a folk rock album that fit better. So yeah, this got relegated to the honorable mentions. I still think Bulbasaur likes it, though. And now, let's conclude the honorable mentions list with some more pop-oriented rock.
Stay inside, scream and shout.
This album was also supposed to go on the list proper originally, in part because of its warm, happy, relaxing atmosphere, and also because of that cover. Seriously, this might be the most Bulbasaur cover of all time. It also has a loose nature theme with songs like Sunshine Type, Butterfly Dream, and Supernatural. The reason it didn't end up on the list proper is that the nature theme is only a loose one, and most of these songs are just love songs. Also, I had another pop album and another rock album on here that I felt fit better. So this album ended up being an honorable mention. Anyway, that's the last of the honorable mentions. Now, let's get to the list proper, starting with number 1.
Heavy horses move underneath behind the bow.
So, not only do I imagine Jethro Tull to be one of Bulbasaur's favorite bands, they're also one of my dad's favorite bands. So, I have a special connection to this one. Anyway, this album is incredibly warm and, for a rock album at least, relaxing. It also has a nature theme, with this album being inspired by the lead singer of Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson, moving to the country for a while. This album is full of references to country life, as well as various animals that live in the country. I imagine Bulbasaur would find this album deeply soothing, not just because of the lyrical themes, but also because of the woodwind section. I imagine Bulbasaur to be a big fan of woodwinds, mostly because they're involved in classical music a lot of the time, and I imagine Bulbasaur to be a pretty big classical fan because it helps plants grow, allegedly. In other words, while I imagine Bulbasaur to be a huge Jethro Tull fan in general, I imagine Heavy Horses to be their favorite because of the aforementioned nature theme and how relaxing it is. Now, let's talk about something even more relaxing, shall we? Here we have the Dungeon Synth album I put onto the list proper, which, interestingly enough, came out the same year as one of the 2 honorable mention Dungeon Synth albums. Wow, 2019 was a great year for Dungeon Synth. Anyway, aside from being relaxing, warm, and happy, this album also has a nature theme, with field recordings throughout, such as the birds chirping at the beginning of Spring Renewal, or the stream flowing at the beginning of the Healing Stream. In other words, it's similar to the other Dungeon Synth album I mentioned earlier, but even more so. Flies the Coop by Holedweller is a bit too lo-fi to be as warm as it could be, but this feels like a warm spring day in a beautiful enchanted garden. Everything about it screams warmth, nature, and beauty, all things I imagine Bulbasaur really appreciates. Because of that, it earned a spot on its list. Now for the album that beat out The Garden of Jane Delaunay by trees, and to some extent, The Visit by Lorena McKennitt.
In a lily pond I lay all upon a summer's day.
Ah yes, folk, what I imagine to be Bulbasaur's favorite genre. To steal a quote from a review I saw on Rate Your Music, this is basically children's music for adults. It's warm, comforting, and whimsical. The song Glowworms is a great example of this, being about a couple of children who sneak out of the house to admire glowworms when they should be asleep. If you think that sounds like something out of a fairy tale, you'd be right. The lyrics to all of the songs on this album are like that, and even some of the vocal melodies sound a bit nursery rhyme-ish. Considering Bulbasaur is shown in the Pokemon Vacation short to be good with kids, I think he would appreciate this. I also think Bulbasaur would appreciate the references to nature on songs like Glowworms, Lily Pond, Swallow Song, and others. Yeah, this album is Bulbasaur in album form, and the fact that it's so soothing means that it just beat out the other folk album in the honorable mentions list. No offense to trees, but this album fits too well. Anyway, let's talk about a jazz album next. So, I really wanted to put a jazz album on this list because I imagine Bulbasaur is at least somewhat of a jazz fan. However, all the albums I was considering were either not as warm as Rate Your Music wants you to think they are, or just don't have much of a nature theme. Then I remembered this album, which is incredibly warm, and which, while not necessarily nature themed, does have a song called Joy Spring on it, which is pretty much about spring. Well, I mean, there's no lyrics on it, but it's meant to evoke the feeling of spring, which is the most nature-oriented season. The rest of the album sounds like Bulbasaur 2 with its warmth and a relaxing atmosphere. Even the more energetic song Parisian Thoroughfare is incredibly warm sounding. And also it's incredibly happy sounding, so it still reminds me of Bulbasaur. This entire album is basically an ode to spring in musical form. And considering I imagine spring to be Bulbasaur's favorite season, I think this album fits. Now, let's talk about a metal album I think Bulbasaur would like. Personally, I don't imagine Bulbasaur to be that much of a metalhead outside of the more melodic side of metal. That said, I think this is probably their favorite metal album, because it has all the beauty and warmth of a folk or classical album. Even the kind of cold song on here, Ice Queen, is at least nature-themed. Anyway, the main reason I put this album on here are that the songs Mother Earth, Never-Ending Story, and Imperfect Harmony all have a nature theme, with some beautiful folk-inspired instrumentation that just screams Bulbasaur. Also, I kind of imagine Bulbasaur as one of those Within Temptation fans who thinks they sold out after Mother Earth came out. I don't know why, but that's the vibe I get. Anyway, now that we've gotten the classical-influenced metal album out of the way, let's talk about some actual classical music, shall we? Classical music is a genre I imagine Bulbasaur is a big fan of, like I said, because it, helps plants grow. And Bulbasaur is a grass type. This album falls into a subgenre of modern classical known as post-minimalism, which basically means it takes the minimal compositions of minimalism and adds other elements. In this case, it adds electronic elements. Honestly, I think the electronic elements make this album sound even more warm and relaxing than it already does. And while it's not explicitly nature-themed, this album does kind of make me feel like I'm skipping through a meadow on a warm spring day. And that, combined with the album cover, makes me think this fits the nature part of this list pretty well. Now for the next album, which is going to be something completely different, that being rap music.
Secrets killing me. Brought a booze from Italy.
Like metal, I don't imagine Bulbasaur to be much of a hip-hop fan. That said, I do think he would like Blade just because of how happy and warm his music is. And on this album, he's actually pretty relaxing. Especially on songs like Wings of Motion, which border on just being dream pop, which is a genre I imagine Bulbasaur likes. Musically, this album sounds like a fairy tale. It's a lot more atmospheric and calm than most rap music, which I think Bulbasaur would appreciate. And the subgenre this album belongs to is cloud rap, which is known for its relaxed atmospheres. I think Bulbasaur probably likes cloud rap more than the more brutal sounding trap style of rap. And I think cloud rap is probably Bulbasaur's favorite rap subgenre, aside from maybe instrumental hip-hop or lo-fi hip-hop. Yeah, I think he likes that atmospheric stuff. The reason I chose this album in particular is that the way this album sounds makes me feel like I'm skipping through a meadow full of butterflies and flowers. Again, not exactly nature-themed, but close enough that I think it counts. But now for a genre I think Bulbasaur does like, ambient music. I imagine Bulbasaur listens to a lot of ambient, dungeon synth, progressive electronic, new age, etc. music, for much the same reason that he listens to a lot of classical. It's calm, it's relaxing, it's beautiful, and a lot of it is quite warm. The reason I chose this specific ambient album, though, is because of the calmness and warmth combined with that album cover. Seriously, the forest depicted on this album cover makes me think more than a little bit of the place where Ash found his Bulbasaur. Also, even the more techno-oriented songs are surprisingly warm for their genre on here. Even without the cover, this album makes me feel like I'm walking through the woods on a crisp autumn day, enjoying everything nature has to offer. This is backed up by some electronic sound effects that are meant to sound like field recordings. If that doesn't scream Bulbasaur, I don't know what does. And speaking of music that screams Bulbasaur, country music! I don't know why country music screams grass type either, but anyway, the next album is a country album.
Hard as hell like a coffin nail, a little mountain to sing.
Like I said, I imagine Bulbasaur to be a pretty big country fan. That said, I also imagine them to be one of those country purists who hear most country pop stuff and cringe. River Fools and Mountain Saints by Ian No may have come out in the Morgan Wallen, Luke Combs era of country music, but it's underground enough and traditional sounding enough that I think Bulbasaur would enjoy it. The reason I chose this instead of any actual old school country, though, is because of how distinctly Appalachian this album is. The lyrics describe a number of hard-living country folk types, and I imagine if Bulbasaur was American, that they would enjoy living that kind of lifestyle. Also, the pastoral feel of the music just screams Bulbasaur. This was actually the last album I added to this list. The reason I hesitated a bit is that parts of it are kind of depressing. Still, I'm sure Bulbasaur gets sad too sometimes, and needs music to relate to during those times. So consider this Bulbasaur's sad album. It does still have plenty of warmth and relaxing instrumentation, so there's that. Now, let's end this with a pop album, shall we?
And sunset.
Now, pop is a genre that I imagine Bulbasaur to be kind of particular about. In this case, I imagine him to only like it when it's as underground and experimental as possible. So here's an art pop album. The reason I chose this art pop album in particular is because it focuses on rural England, which I imagine Bulbasaur would approve of for much the same reason he approved of the American country music sound. This album conveys this both musically and lyrically, with a lush, beautiful, and warm sound throughout both the instrumentation and William Doyle's voice. I also think the pure ambient tracks would draw Bulbasaur into this one, partially because they're gorgeous, partially because one of them features Brian Eno himself, and also partially because Bulbasaur really likes ambient music. Yeah, Bulbasaur may not be much of a pop fan, but if there was ever a pop album for Bulbasaur, it would be this one. And that's my video. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. I'm Morgan the Rebellious Reviewer, and I'm out.